For less than 48 hours, global markets behaved as if history had just changed. Billions of dollars moved, stocks surged, and one name sat at the center of it all: Donald Trump. Standing on a world stage speaking as President of the United States, Donald Trump announced that the U.S. had secured exclusive control over Greenland's vast mineral wealth. The message was simple: America was back, China was out, and a historic deal had been done. Investors didn't wait. Within hours, money poured into anything connected to Greenland. Headlines called it a geopolitical breakthrough. Commentators compared it to the Louisiana Purchase. And a previously obscure company tied to Greenland mining became the hottest trade on the market. But almost immediately, a second conversation began quietly forming beneath the excitement. Not about how valuable Greenland was. Everyone already knew that. The question was something far more basic. Did the deal Donald Trump described actually exist? Because according to documents and communications that later began circulating online, what the public believed was a finalized agreement may not have been a binding deal at all. Instead, it may have been something far more limited, and that difference matters. Greenland isn't just ice and territory. It holds rare earth elements essential to modern technology, materials used in fighter jets, smartphones, electric vehicles, and advanced weapons systems. For years, the United States has openly wanted to reduce its dependence on China for these resources. That strategic goal was real. That interest was legitimate, which is why Trump's announcement sounded believable. In the days leading up to the statement, reports surfaced suggesting negotiations were underway. U.S. media spoke confidently about an imminent agreement. Maps circulated. Language like sovereignty, control, and exclusive access appeared again and again. Then came the moment that locked the narrative in place. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Donald Trump publicly reinforced the claim, signaling that the United States now held decisive leverage over Greenland's resources. Markets treated that statement as confirmation. Prices exploded upward, retail investors rushed in, institutional money followed. But behind closed doors, foreign governments were reportedly expressing confusion. According to later statements, Denmark, which retains sovereignty over Greenland, had not agreed to any transfer of ownership or control. Officials in Greenland itself made similar claims, and that contradiction raised a critical question. If no binding agreement existed, if no sovereign rights had actually changed hands, then what exactly had investors just bought into? Because by the time those doubts reached the public, the momentum was already unstoppable. And as the next few days would reveal, the story wasn't just about diplomacy. It was about timing. It was about money. And it was about why regulators would soon start paying very close attention. To understand how this story unraveled, we have to look at the document that made the entire announcement feel real. The thick binder, the official-looking paperwork, the pages that were held up in front of cameras and never released in full. Because according to people who later examined the material, what was presented as a historic agreement may not have been a deal at all. Instead, it appears to have been a memorandum of understanding. That distinction matters. A memorandum of understanding, or MOU, is not a binding contract. It does not transfer ownership. It does not grant exclusive rights. It does not change sovereignty. In most cases, it simply outlines intentions to cooperate. According to officials in Denmark, the document they signed related to Arctic research and environmental cooperation, academic exchanges, data sharing, joint studies. Nothing about mining rights, nothing about mineral extraction, nothing about transferring control, and nothing about excluding China. Yet publicly, the language surrounding the announcement told a very different story. Words like control, exclusive access, and sovereignty were used repeatedly. Maps appeared showing Greenland visually aligned with U.S. strategic interests. Media coverage framed the move as a decisive geopolitical shift. That contrast created confusion, because while investors believed a deal had been finalized, foreign governments were reportedly scrambling to clarify that no such agreement existed. Denmark reaffirmed that Greenland remained fully autonomous under the Kingdom of Denmark. Greenland's own leadership echoed the same position. There had been no sale, no lease, no transfer of mineral rights. So, how did such a dramatic gap form between what was signed and what was said? Analysts point to a critical detail. The announcement relied on implication rather than disclosure. The full text of the document was never released at the time. Instead, selected phrases were emphasized, visuals were carefully chosen, and the broader narrative was allowed to run ahead of the facts. That approach didn't technically require inventing a document. It only required allowing the public to assume what the document meant, and markets filled in the blanks instantly. Because Greenland's value wasn't hypothetical. Its rare earth deposits are well documented. Its strategic importance is well understood. So when the President of the United States spoke with confidence, markets reacted accordingly. But as days passed, a new pattern began to emerge. Foreign leaders stopped echoing the claim. Clarifications became firmer, and journalists began requesting the full text of the agreement. That's when the narrative began to wobble. If the deal was real, why wasn't it published? If sovereignty had shifted, why were Denmark and Greenland denying it? And if no binding agreement existed, why had so much money already changed hands? Those questions would soon move beyond media speculation. Because as the discrepancy between the document and the claims grew clearer, attention began shifting away from diplomacy and toward the timing of the market reaction itself. In part 3, we follow that timing and why investigators started focusing less on the announcement and more on what happened just before and just after it was made. Once doubts began forming around the Greenland announcement, analysts stopped asking diplomatic questions. They started asking financial ones. Because the most unusual part of the story wasn't what was said on stage, it was what happened in the markets around it. In the days leading up to Donald Trump's public statements, a little-known company tied to Greenland's mining narrative began showing unusual activity. Trading volumes spiked, price movements accelerated, and interest appeared long before any official confirmation. That timing raised eyebrows. According to market analysts, the company at the center of the surge had all the characteristics of a speculative vehicle, limited operations, minimal public disclosures, and assets that were largely theoretical. Yet within days, its valuation multiplied. Retail investors rushed in first, drawn by headlines and the promise of strategic minerals. Then larger players followed, amplifying the momentum. The turning point came after the Davos remarks, when Donald Trump publicly reinforced the idea of U.S. control over Greenland's resources. Markets treated it as final confirmation. Prices surged again, liquidity flooded in, and the trade reached a level few believed possible just a week earlier. But this is where investigators reportedly began focusing their attention, not on who bought, but on who sold. Because while many investors were still entering positions, filings and transaction data later suggested that certain entities were reducing exposure near the peak. Large blocks moved quietly, positions were unwound, and profits were locked in while enthusiasm remained high. That pattern is not illegal by itself, but combined with public statements from the highest office in the United States, it becomes something regulators examine very closely, especially when timing aligns this precisely. According to financial reporting, the selling occurred during a narrow window, a window that closed quickly once doubts about the deal began circulating more openly. Shortly afterward, momentum reversed. Prices fell, liquidity dried up, and investors who entered late found themselves holding positions that rapidly lost value. By the time official clarifications from Denmark and Greenland reached broader audiences, the market had already shifted. Losses mounted, confidence evaporated, and questions multiplied. Who knew what and when? Why did certain entities exit while others were still buying? And how did a non-binding document trigger such a massive financial reaction? These are the kinds of questions that don't stay within the financial press for long, because when market behavior intersects with political power, regulators pay attention. And that attention was already starting to move. In Part 4, we look at how agencies like the SEC and the Department of Justice reportedly began responding, and why this situation quickly moved beyond a market story. Once the market reversal became impossible to ignore, attention shifted away from headlines and toward enforcement. Because when political statements appear to move markets, regulators don't focus on intent first. They focus on impact. According to public reporting, trading activity connected to the Greenland related surge began drawing scrutiny from financial authorities. The Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, is tasked with enforcing rules against market manipulation and misleading statements that affect stock prices. And under U.S. securities law, public claims that materially influence investor behavior are examined very carefully, especially when those claims come from positions of extraordinary authority. Analysts began pointing to a core legal question. If a public figure makes statements that markets reasonably interpret as confit, and if those statements later appear inconsistent with the underlying documents, at what point does analysis turn into investigation? The SEC's role is not to determine political truth. It is to determine whether investors were misled. That distinction matters. At the same time, legal experts noted that other agencies could become involved as well. The Department of Justice evaluates whether conduct crosses from regulatory violation into potential criminal exposure. That includes questions around wire fraud, disclosure obligations, and coordinated activity. Any review would focus on evidence, emails, transaction timing, communications, and the sequence of events surrounding public statements. Importantly, investigations don't begin with conclusions. They begin with patterns. And the pattern here raised flags: a non-binding document, extraordinary claims, a rapid market surge, targeted selling near the peak, and swift losses once clarifications emerged. That sequence is exactly what enforcement agencies are trained to notice. Meanwhile, political pressure was building. Foreign governments reiterated their positions. Danish officials publicly stated that no sovereignty or resource control had been transferred. Greenland's leadership reinforced the same message. As contradictions became harder to dismiss, media coverage shifted tone. What was once framed as a historic breakthrough began to be described as a misunderstanding, then a misrepresentation, then something potentially more serious. By this stage, the question was no longer whether the announcement had been exaggerated, it was whether trust itself had been damaged, because markets don't operate on confidence alone, they operate on credibility. And when credibility collapses, the fallout extends far beyond a single trade. In Part 5, we examine where that fallout landed and why this story may ultimately be remembered less for what was claimed and more for who believed it. Long after the chart stopped moving, the real damage became clear. It wasn't just financial, it was psychological. For many investors, this wasn't a speculative trade. It wasn't a risky gamble. It was a decision built on trust. They believed that when the President of the United States spoke publicly about a geopolitical agreement, the fundamentals were real. They believed the deal had substance. They believed the claims had been verified. And when those beliefs collapsed, the reaction wasn't just anger, it was betrayal. Online forums filled with stories from retail investors who said they bought because they trusted the announcement. Some described investing retirement savings. Others spoke about following the narrative because it felt patriotic, because it felt strategic, because it felt official. That's what made this moment different from past controversies. Political scandals often divide along party lines. Financial losses do not. When money disappears, ideology fades quickly. Analysts began pointing out a pattern seen throughout history. Populist leaders can survive criticism. They can survive media attacks. They can even survive failed policies. But they rarely survive accusations that they misled their own supporters financially, because trust, once broken at that level, does not easily return. Internationally, the impact was just as real. Diplomatic relationships were strained, clarifications had to be issued, and confidence in U.S. messaging took a hit. Markets recalibrated, investors became cautious, and future announcements were treated with skepticism rather than excitement. Over time, the Greenland episode began to resemble other moments in financial history. Events where belief moved faster than verification, where narrative outran documentation, and where credibility paid the price. What ultimately matters is not whether a single announcement was exaggerated. It's what the episode revealed about how power, information, and markets now interact. When political authority intersects with financial speculation, the consequences multiply. Because the audience is no longer just voters, it's investors, pension funds, families, and institutions built on long term confidence. That's why this story doesn't end with a stock chart, it ends with a lesson. In modern markets, credibility is currency. And once it's spent, it's very hard to earn back. If stories like this matter to you and you want clear, calm explanations of how power and markets intersect, subscribe to Power Brief. New breakdowns every week.